Thank you. Welcome. Let's get started, everyone. Welcome to online and here at the Stimson Center for today's program on Reimagining Global Order Perspectives from Professor Amitav Acharya, Trita Parsi, and Heather Hurlburt. I'm Richard Ponzio, and here at Stimson, I direct the Global Governance, Justice, and Security program. Against the backdrop of today's devastating wars, runaway climate change, unconstrained artificial intelligence, and other factors fueling longstanding injustice and inequality, global order appears fragile and in flux. The apex of the global cooperation system, the United Nations, will begin its 9th decade on the 24th of this month, United Nations Day. Despite reaching this milestone, the erosion of multilateral norms, laws, and institutions challenges the very core of efforts to build a just and stable world order. Before I introduce our distinguished panel here on the stage, for this finale of 6 UNGA at 80 high-level events the last 2 weeks, I wish to invite to the podium 2 longtime collaborators with the Stimson Center and co-sponsors for today's program to further welcome everyone and share updates from their respective organizations. First, we have Paula Bolin, well known here as the president of the United Nations Association here in the National Capital area. Paula.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a vital conversation. Many thanks to Dr. Ponzio and the Stimson Center for hosting today's timely discussion in collaboration with the Council on the UN System. I have the pleasure of leading the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, which is one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA, serving DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. We are a diverse and inclusive organization devoted to educating and mobilizing Americans in support of a strong US-UN partnership. Along with the UN Foundation and Better World campaign, we constitute the largest network of Americans in support of the UN. We engage members of all ages through a variety of educational programs and advocacy, such as our Model UN, graduate fellows, as well as professional and leadership development opportunities for students and young professionals. I hope you will consider joining UNANCA, if not yet a member, and engage in our active programming, including a special celebration later this month to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the United Nations at the Embassy of France. As we gather here, and as Richard mentioned, the world faces an array of converging crises, conflicts, climate breakdown, sweeping technological transformation, and a deepening sense of injustice and inequality. These are not just challenges of implementation. They are tests of the assumptions that we have underpinned our international system in recent decades. As the UN marks the start of its 9th decade, global order is changing. New perspectives are now emerging on reimagining multilateralism to better address deepening inequality and injustice. There is momentum and opportunity for great regional and domestic action for implementation of the many international commitments we have. In this moment of change, we are fortunate to be guided by thinkers whose work help us see beyond the fractures of the present and imagine possible paths forward. I believe today's conversation is not just about choosing between pessimism or optimism, but about clarity. Clarity about the nature of change, clarity about what we value, clarity about which direction we want to push. Looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Now I'd like to welcome Professor Martha Thomas, Executive Director of the Academic Council on the UN System, based here at Georgetown University. Martha.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll do all of this height. Thank you very much to the Stimson Center for hosting this most relevant and timely event. And thank you, Richard, and your team, Rebecca, and others who have brought these distinguished group of scholars and thinkers together. I look forward to the insightful exchange by Professor Amitav, Dr. Parsi, and Heather Hurlburt on the issue of reimagining the global order. I'm Martha Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, ACUNS, and we're an organization that's founded in 1987, so we've 39 years of operations, and we are currently hosted at Georgetown University, so I wear two hats. I'm both the Executive Director of ACUNS as well as an Assistant Professor of the Practice in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. For us at ACUNS, this conversation on reimagining the global order is at the heart of what ACUNS sees as essential at this critical juncture. This is a dialogue that allows us to confront the mismatch between today's challenges and yesterday's institutions. It brings legitimacy and representation to the table, and it allows for visionary engagement that helps avoid fragmentation by fostering shared principles in a rapidly changing world. This type of discourse was so important to us at ACUNS that our next year's annual meeting, I should stop and say that I am very proud and happy to say that my very good friend and longtime working partner, Richard Ponzio, is the co-chair of our next year 2026 annual meeting in Lisbon, Portugal, from the 1st to the 3rd of July. Our theme coincides very much with this conversation on multilateralism under challenge and the future of the pact. And so the goal for us next year is to encourage scholars, thinkers, practitioners, students, diplomats to critically evaluate the challenges to multilateralist reform and also to assess opportunities for innovative solutions to long-standing problems by using regional, civil, courts, and other networks that are non-traditional key players in this game. I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about ACUNS. Our organization, in addition to the annual meeting, we do also organize a workshop. Our annual meeting certainly is the flagship. We bring together 400 to 500 scholars each year in a venue. This year it was in Kenya. Next year it will be in Lisbon, Portugal. And we take into account the mood and the changing of our times, where we allow practitioners and scholars to engage in critical, evidence-based analysis of multilateralism, specifically the broader UN system. We also host a workshop, and interestingly enough, with the changing tides of times, our next year's workshop will be in Kazakhstan, and it will be on the value added of regional organizations. And so we're certainly thinking about what the landscape is looking like in the world today. I want to encourage all of you to become a member, to participate in and engage with us, network with us, be our friend, sign up for our monthly newsletter, submit an application to participate in our annual meeting, and I look forward to continuing this network and engagement with you.
Thank you, Martha. Now turning to our panelists and our theme today, Reimagining Global Order. First, I will call to the podium Professor Amitav Acharya, here to my right, Distinguished Professor of International Relations at American University and former President of the International Studies Association, to introduce his refreshingly original and at times provocative new book, right here, The Once and Future World Order, Why Global Civilization Will Survive the Decline of the West. Immediately afterwards, I'll kindly request Dr. Trita Parsi, yes, we've coordinated our shirts for today's program, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, to share, coming off the back of last year's Summit of the Future and last week's UNGA High-Level Week in New York, several timely, bold, and carefully researched recommendations from the Quincy Institute's Better Order Project toward a better security order. Finally, and now that it's October, I'm pleased to say we have a trick or treat for all of you today. Actually, it's more of a treat with the widely admired Heather Hurlburt as our discussant, and many of you know she's recently served as Chief of Staff to the prior U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and is currently an Associate Fellow with Chatham House. Following their initial remarks from the podium, we'll have time for a moderated discussion and then, of course, Q&A and a dialogue with all of you. Professor Acharya.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Richard, Rebecca, and the staff of Stimson for organizing this event. And of course, very happy to see colleagues on the stage. Let me start by saying, why am I here? This book, why is this book relevant to your immediate concerns, which is about the United Nations, 80th anniversary, the multilateralism. This is a book about world order going back to 5,000 years. Now, there was not only no United Nations, but no United States of America either. So I want to begin by telling you why this book is relevant. Now, many of us think of the UN, well, San Francisco Conference 80 years ago, UN Charter. Of course, we go back to the League of Nations. We go back to the Concert of Europe in the 19th century in tracing the origins of multilateralism. However, I'm arguing that almost all the foundational principles of the United Nations, including diplomacy, peace treaties, open or free trade, or you can call it freedom of the seas as a norm, and also humanitarian principles, including human rights, Geneva Convention type of principles, protection of civilians, protecting combatants who have surrendered or injured. All of this goes back to long antiquity. We just don't think about it because our textbooks don't tell you about it. So that's the one thing I'll try to do. The second thing is that even 80 years ago, when we're fairly advanced into modern history, and the UN Charter is a pretty comprehensive document, but there are a lot of gaps in the UN Charter, partly because it was drafted mainly, even though there were actually 30 countries that we consider as Global South today, out of the 50 that are actually present in San Francisco. But most of the leadership positions, with one exception of what is treated as ECOSOC, was by Western countries. And those included people like Ian Smarts, the South African Prime Minister, who was present both at the League of Nations and UN founding. And Winston Churchill played a very important role, refused to discuss colonialism at the UN, refused to discuss racism. So I'll talk about it. So those gaps from sovereign equality to racial equality, from colonialism as a violation of human rights, gender rights, they were filled later in covenants, in declarations, and mostly under the leadership of, again, the countries we call Global South. So those will be relevant to you mostly, but I hope the whole history will be relevant to you as well. So these are the four key arguments. I know I have 10, 12 minutes. So I'll be very fast, but I hope I'll tease you enough that you can buy the book. I'm happy to sign it. So the main argument is number one, creating world order, basically ensuring stability, dispelling chaos. This is an Egyptian term, Ispet versus Mat, that I use. Goes back, repeated in every culture and civilization. The order means establishing stability, not peace, but stability and dispelling chaos. But in a large part of the world, there is no such thing as a truly global order. All world orders are actually regional or interregional. And in a given period of time, orders come and go like nations. It's not a monopoly of any country, any civilization. It's certainly not a monopoly of the West, monopoly of the United States. It is a shared creation. Now, shared may sound nice, but it's actually true. It's because many of the institutions and principles, ideas, and mechanisms were developed either independently or through diffusion in multiple places around the world, including parts of the world that were not so-called discovered, like in the Americas, for example, including this continent before Columbian voyages. That includes the empire, independence of states, sovereignty by another name, diplomacy, peace treaties, free trade, humanitarian values, and much more. The whole book is basically based on uncovering, tracing the origins of these ideas and institutions. I'll give you only a few examples because I don't have time. The rise of the West depended on Europe's borrowing such ideas from others, innovations from non-Western civilization, and of course, extracting resources from them. And non-Western societies, what we call Global South, are not passive beneficiaries, but active contributors to the post-World War II world order. I mentioned the gaps that need to be filled, but even at the San Francisco conference. In areas such as self-determination, human rights, racial equality, and multilateralism as well. The decline of the Western dominance, maybe the most controversial line here, doesn't mean the end of world order. I'm not saying the decline of Western dominance means the end of Western civilization. That's not the idea. And also, it's not the end of the West. It's the civilizational idea of the West, which is very racially and politically, ideologically constructed in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is not really something to worry about. This is an opportunity, I see, to build a more inclusive world order, where leadership and influence are spread among different powers, regions, and civilizations. Without further ado, you hear so much about multipolarity, how bad it is, because American hegemony is declining. Now, this is a very good example of how the great powers of the ancient Near East, 5 of them, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, Babylon, and Assyria, kept peace. It's just like a modern concert system that we have today. The modern P5 in the Security Council. These are the great powers of that period, mid-15th century BC, and they maintained peace for 200 years, probably more, in the area. The concert of Europe, created after the defeat of Napoleon in Europe, lasted only 50 years, from 1815 to the Crimean War, and it led to World War I and World War II. Again, you can read about this, but it's an article in Foreign Policy I recently wrote, also talks about this. So multipolarity, because the West or US is declining, doesn't have to lead to chaos. It can be managed, and there is precedence in deep history to manage it. This is important, this. The UN principle of non-aggression, non-alliance, well, maybe the NATO principle, but let's say collective security, collective defense, and non-aggression. This is the first peace treaty that we have evidence of. Egypt and Hittites in 1259 BC, Treaty of Kadesh is called. Well, look at the great prince of Hatti shall not trespass against the land of Egypt or take anything from it, and Egypt will do the same thing. There is also extradition, that if maybe not a very nice principle, but if a rebel against Egypt goes to Hatti and hides there, Hatti will return the rebel, vice versa. And these are principles that are embodied almost word by word in UN Charter. There is actually, this treaty is interesting. There is an Egyptian version in Pharaonic language, and there is an Akkadian version, which is now in the Istanbul Museum. They're identical. They're not cheating on each other. The same thing is there, and the UN actually has, the Turkish government donated a copy of it, and you'll find that as you enter the UN today. And the other one actually you can see in the Istanbul Museum. Freedom of the seas. Well, look at the two statements. We give credit to Hugo Grotius. He was on the payroll of the Dutch East India Company. He defended his cousin, who actually attacked and sank a Portuguese ship off Singapore in 1603, and that became a matter of adjudication, arbitration, and he wrote a treaty. He wrote a treatise, like a legal brief. Lawyers should know that, saying that sea is for everybody. Dutch should not be harassed. The Dutch has the right to trade in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese should not be harassing them. To cut a long story short, but what happened was the Grotius was actually in the payroll of the Dutch East India Company, which ended up being establishing a larger monopoly over Indonesia, and exactly the same thing, made it impossible for traders in Indian Ocean to trade with each other without going through them. So the Sultan of Makassar said to the Dutch, when Dutch harassed him, said, you have to sell it to us. You cannot sell directly to Malacca. We will sell it for you. We'll give you a cut. Well, God made the land and the sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. This is the Indian Ocean tradition. This is the Indian Ocean trading network, the largest trading network in the world before the transatlantic and trans-Pacific networks happened. Who was leading it? Not India, not China. It's a small little port city states. Well, Malindi, Mombasa, Mogadishu, Aden, Hormuz, Calicut, Masiliputam, Tamralepti, Malacca, Palembang, to mention a few. There was no hegemon. This was entirely hegemon. So the idea that you need a hegemon like Britain and United States to maintain free trade has no basis in history. The free trade openness was not invented by the British and the Americans. And finally, on this point, Malacca, with the center of this trade in 15th century, 84 languages, traders of every nationality managed not by the Sultan, but a committee of 10 traders, and at a population of 100,000. Now, why would you then think that free trade was invented by the British? If you think of free trade in the modern sense, I'm talking open seas, openness of seas, seas as global common, is very much a principle from here. So these are some of the other examples: independent state system, great power cooperation, Persia's religious tolerance and ethnic tolerance, Joshua principles from ancient India, word by word, Geneva Conventions from 1st century BC, word by word, how to protect civilians, how to protect non-combatants, how to protect soldiers who have surrendered, who have been wounded, who have been sleeping, don't to use poisonous weapons. You can find that. The Mali's Mandan Charter, right to life and property, long-distance trade, which Europeans benefited from later, from Mongols, Inca, decentralized empire, which is a good example from the Inca federal empire, and federation here in this continent, the Iroquois Confederacy, which Benjamin Franklin admired. The US Congress actually has passed a resolution recognizing this as an influence on the founding, so-called founding fathers of the United States, that if they can do it, why can't we do it? Okay. Does the past matter? Why are we going back to 5,000 years, 3,000 years? Well, this is because of this. There was a statement by Robert Dahl, political scientist, formerly at Yale. Now, of course, he's passed away. To deny that Athens was a democracy would be like saying that what the Wright brothers invented was not an airplane, because their early machine is has so little resemblance to what we have today. True. But then why if we give credit to Athens for inventing democracy, which had 12.7% people could vote, which had no individual liberty. Ancient Athens had no individual liberty. The liberty meant liberty of the state, polis, not liberty of the individual. We give them credit for inventing democracy. I have no problems with that. But why can't we do the same thing for the Muslim civilization, Hindu civilization? They also invented the Inca civilization ideas in early prototypes, foundational forms. But they did. Okay, so how am I doing with time, Richard? Okay, now we come to the UN today. These are ideas that we are in the UN Charter. But if there was no Indian woman, Indian representative called Hansa Mehta, we would still be having all men are created equal. She was actually in the Human Rights Commission and objected to this language, the language, the chauvinistic language that all men are taken from the French Revolution language, so all human beings are created equal. Adding the idea that human rights violation include colonialism. Colonialism is a form of violation of human rights. Moving from equality of states to equality of races. This was not there in the UN. Sorry. Look at the San Francisco Conference. There are 22 volumes of San Francisco Conference available online, searchable. I had a research assistant go through them, looking for words: colonial, colonies, colonialism, non-discrimination, racism, racial equality. You don't find too many of this, because Winston Churchill said, if you discuss colonialism, Britain will walk out. Jens Smuts was leading one of the major committees. So who did this? It was basically the Global South countries. Later on, from Bandung Conference, most of the covenants were led by Global South countries, because the British and Americans did not want to discuss human rights later because it meant anti-colonialism. And Britain still had a lot of colonies in the 50s. So moving on, then finally, this is what I wrote the book. I wrote this book starting a course, teach a course in 2013 at American University. And I went looking for a text. And in 2014, Kissinger published his book, world order, still the bestseller in the world. Look at how he starts. Starts with Europe, right? Oh, sorry. Pluralistic international system. Second chapter, Europe. Third chapter, Islam, a world in disorder. And then goes to India, little section. China, little section. And then America as the savior of all mankind. I thought I cannot give it to my students, even though they're very American patriots. They have to learn history. This is not the history of world order. So I wrote this book. We start with Egypt, Persia, and we go on to the Americas too. So I think this is an alternative history of world order. It has a lot of relevance for also where multilateralism came from, where ideas, the founding principles of UN came from. They are universal from the beginning. They're not the monopoly or creation of the West. Even the post-war international order, a global order, it's also had a lot of contributions. Stop here.
Conventional orthodoxies in how we're taught to think about international relations and world order, especially here in the West, and how we can draw upon history, the 5,000 years that you covered in this magnificent new book, to prepare to cope with current and emerging challenges to today's increasingly multipolar world. Now, without any further ado, we'll have Trita Parsi introduce the Better Order Project of the Quincy Institute. Trita, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you to Stimson Center. Always a great pleasure to be here with Richard and with Heather, and great honor to be here also with Amitav. I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's really an eye-opening. I'm a little bit partial to chapter 2, Greek myths and Persian power. Definitely read that chapter. It's very good, very true. Here to talk to you a little bit about the work that we did at the Better Order Project. It's a project that we started about 2 years ago at the Quincy Institute. We brought together 130 scholars from 40 countries with a particular emphasis on the Global South. But we also included, of course, many people from Washington. Chris Priebel from the Stimson Center was a very critical voice in that project. And we came up with 20 detailed proposals along 7 variables on how we have to reform critical elements of the global governing structure as the world transitions away from unipolarity. One of the things we did that I think ended up being quite useful is that we imagined that we were in the year 2040. We imagined that we had not reformed the UN Security Council. We imagined that climate change had not been fully addressed. But we had also not gone into a war between the US and China. And in that moment of 2040, we're really on the cusp of a complete collapse of the system. We added on to it that at that point, there's no longer a debate about unipolarity versus multipolarity. Multipolarity has been internalized in the actions and the strategies of every country. And we asked ourselves, given this profound systemic change and the last moment before catastrophe, what type of flexibilities would that unlock? And can we then go back and look at all of these different issues, from climate to UN Security Council reform, et cetera, and ask ourselves, in that scenario, with that systemic shift, what kind of flexibilities is unlocked and what kind of solutions can we find? And given the proposals that we came up with the input of all of these different people from these different countries, which included UN ambassadors, foreign ministers, defense ministers, former head of the OSCE, we understood, okay, we can end up here. These are the proposals we can end up, and then we can also then start working backwards. If we know that that's the scenario that we likely will be in, if we know that in that scenario we will have the flexibility to agree to these different things, then we can prepare the political ground to get to that point already now. And that's what the project is currently doing. Particularly, we're quite involved on UN Security Council reform. But I wanted to focus now, and we can go into the details of the proposals during the Q&A perhaps. I wanted to focus now on why we did it and why we thought that this was so critical. A key reason as to why we started to really worry about where we were heading. It's not just because of the usual global trends that we all point to. It's also in the manner that we saw that the Biden administration had started to interpret and use the term rules-based international order. A term that to most sounds really good. Rules, who could be possibly against that? Oftentimes misunderstood as being the same thing as the UN Charter and international law. But when you scratch the surface of it, you realize that the conception was really quite different. In the 2022 NSS, the Biden administration does not describe the RBIO as a global system of norms, principles, and institutions. Rather, it is conceiving the RBIO as a non-universal bloc of states, asserting that the United States, and this is very critical, and I quote, will support and strengthen partnerships with countries that subscribe to the rules-based order and will make sure that those countries can defend themselves against foreign threats. So you had a conception of the RBIO that essentially is some sort of a bloc. You subscribe to it. And if you do, you will have support of the United States in a military sense, essentially starting to make it sound as if some sort of a NATO plus being created. And also critical to understand the difference between a law-centered order and a rule-centered order, in the sense that laws, as we all know, countries sign on to voluntarily. There's a set process, an objective process of how they come about. The United States never signed on to the Rome Statute, and as a result is not obligated to arrest Bibi Netanyahu when he comes to the United States, because we're not bound, but something that we didn't sign on to. Who makes the rules, however? What is the process of the rulemaking? It's a very different, non-transparent process, essentially led by a couple of Western states with the expectation that it has to bind all countries in the world. What that does then is help create essentially a coalition of the willing type of an alliance. And this is very dangerous in our view, not to contradict Amitav in the sense that multipolarity has existed before, but what we were fearing is that if other countries, Russia, China, also start moving in the direction of their own coalition of the willing, rules-based type of an order, then we will not just have a multiplex or a multipolar world, we will have a multi-order world. Without the benefit that existed during the Cold War, which is that at the top of the system, though we had a multi-order world, at the top of the system there was nevertheless a soft acceptance of the UN Charter, of the authority of the UN Security Council, and all of the international laws that were set by it. We would not have that. And given the common threats that we're faced with in this century, from climate to pandemics, etc., we fear that this would really drive us in a very, very dangerous direction. Now, there is a history of this idea of coalition of the willing type of alternatives to a law-centered order. And I want to cite to you what Richard Pearl wrote in The Guardian in 2003 on the very eve of the invasion of Iraq. The title of the op-ed is "Thank God for the Death of the UN." And he writes that Saddam will go down and thankfully take the UN with him. What will die is the fantasy of the UN as the foundation of a new world order. We are left with coalitions of the willing. Far from disparaging them as a threat to the new world order, we should recognize that they are by default the best hope for that order and the true alternative to the anarchy of the abject failure of the UN. There's a thread here in which you have both from the Republican and the Democratic side various degrees of attitudes towards the UN, a very explicit, aggressive, negative approach by the Bush administration and thinkers like Pearl, but also during Democratic administrations, at times, not all, but particularly towards the end of the Biden administration, a shift towards hollowing out the international system, the law-centered order, the UN. Both of them have been a threat to the creation of a more just world order. Now, of course, we are now in the Trump administration. And during the Trump administration, no one is using the word RBIO or rules-based international order, too many syllables. But at the end of the day, the negative, aggressive approach to the system remains in place, perhaps in a much more naked way. There is, however, perhaps surprisingly, ironically, paradoxically, a bit of a potential promise in all of this. And I want to really emphasize the word potential. And the reason I say this is that the Trump administration, with what Secretary Rubio said early on, I think it was in February, he said that the world is multipolar, which shockingly, was a shocking statement. And that's because out of the last years of the administration, using the word multipolarity was essentially viewed as a Putin talking point, even though in 2010, Hillary Clinton said that the world is multipolar. But not only did he say that it's multipolar, he said that unipolarity was an aberration. It was an abnormality. It was a historical accident. It's not the normal state of affairs. Now, if you recognize that the world is multipolar, if you recognize that unipolarity is an aberration, then you also recognize that the United States no longer has the relative power to constrain rival powers in the same manner that it did before. During unipolarity, of course, the US did have that power. And as a result, it had an attitude towards the UN as being unnecessary and primarily a constraint on the United States. But if you now recognize that we don't have that power any longer, yet we do have a need for a constraint on rival powers, then we have to ask ourselves, what are the alternative instruments in order to be able to achieve some of those constraints short of our own power? And that's where the multilateral system comes in. That's where international law comes in. That's where the UN order comes in which the United States, as a member of a multipolar world, no longer a unipolar power, essentially, potentially will make the same bargain that every other country has made, which is we accept constraints on ourselves because of the value of imposing those same constraints on others. A bargain that was never attractive when the US was a unipolar power or when the US thought that it could reverse matters towards back to unipolarity. But when you have said that the world is multipolar and you have said that unipolarity is an aberration, you're also then accepting that working towards restoring that aberration is a non-winning formula and a non-starter. And so with that, I want to again emphasize, I don't believe that this is the conclusion the administration has reached. I'm saying, though, that that is the logical conclusion of some of their statements. Whether they will ultimately move in that direction is a completely different story, but it is a very important difference, because when you had a neoconservative dominance of the Republican Party, then the effort, the focus was to restore and prolong unipolarity for as long as possible. Now we have a potential alternative. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Trita. And thank you for, like Amitav, in many ways, he presented his new book, Challenging Basic Assumptions That Guide Both National and Global Security Thinking in This Town. Whether you're someone with fears, who fears the transition away from unipolarity or welcomes it as an opportunity, you'll find much to like in this new report from the Quincy Institute, the Better Order Project, and its many recommendations on making more adequate the laws and norms of the future and helping the world adjust to the realities of post-unipolarity. But now to challenge our basic assumptions and orthodoxies even a bit further, we're very delighted to have back here at Stimson, Heather Hurlburt. Heather.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for having me join this very stimulating conversation. I sat here for the last 20 minutes, Richard, trying to come up with a Halloween joke, and I failed. So there we are.
Trick or treat.
Trick or treat. But I will say, when you originally asked me to serve as discussant on this panel, you asked me, was I more optimistic or more pessimistic? And I was so delighted, Paula, in your introductory remarks that you challenged us not to choose between optimism and pessimism. And so I'm going to do that because I will acknowledge, like many of you, when I sat down and started putting some remarks together, my causes for pessimism somewhat outstripped my causes for optimism. So maybe I'll start by seconding the praise that both of you have offered for Amitav's book. You should read the whole thing. You will find something in it that you didn't know, and something in it that you'll violently disagree with, and something that will make you think differently. And I really can't think of something better to recommend a book. And as I said on social media, I wished I was currently teaching undergrads so that I could assign them this book. But when I came back and thought about the challenge posed by Trita's report, the first thing that came to my mind actually was something that James Baldwin said, which is that not everything can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so in a profound way, just the fact that we're finally having this conversation is one of my reasons for optimism. That Trita, I would maybe disagree as a good alumna of the Biden administration with a number of things you said But I will agree that we've had a real problem in Washington, and not just in Washington in recent years, that if you pointed out that parts or all of the international system were in crisis, you got told, shh, you'll just give the opponents ammunition. And we globally, frankly, not just in Washington, not just in the Democratic Party, we globally failed in not being willing to listen sooner to the voices who were saying, hey, this really isn't working. And I think perhaps the largest problem, which is really, I think, a little different than problems that we've had at other moments in history, is the gap between what we say we're doing in the international system and what we're actually able to do with it. So I'll sort of put that out there as a couple of opening thoughts. Paradoxically, I think the brilliance of Amitav, your argument, and the reasons you give for long-term optimism are also my reasons for short-term pessimism and my reasons for skepticism about the recommendations presented in the Better Order report, which is that the process of orders declining and new orders arising and orders bumping into each other is an ugly and violent one, throughout history, doesn't matter whose order it is. And that is very much the period we are living in at the moment, where various sub-global and aspirationally global orders are trying to figure out how they relate to one another, what they control, and what that control looks like. And I think, again, it's helpful to name that straightforwardly, that we're not in a moment of optimistic rulemaking. And crucially, the system that we have, incomplete and disappointing as it is, has grown and been built largely out of wanting to prevent whatever the last disaster was from recurring. And frankly, it's done perhaps almost too good a job in that we tend to have forgotten just how awful a global war would be and how much worse that would be even than the horrible regional wars that we're seeing at the moment. And then similarly, the institutions of the post-Cold War, which were designed, frankly, to prevent the reemergence of global communism, has done a great job on preventing the reemergence of global communism. And for a while did quite well at encouraging human flourishing and has now fallen off on that score. So a cause for pessimism is rather if you think the international system is only capable of acting, not, Trita, it was interesting to me that the way you structured the project was we haven't had the worst imaginable catastrophe, but we're looking over the brink of it. And one could reasonably look, frankly, not just at the history of the last 80 years, but of global history and say, we're actually only capable as a species of acting after the worst thing we can imagine has happened. So that's to me a pretty big reason for pessimism. But now I want to offer some reasons for optimism that I pulled out of both of your work. And first, actually, as I read through your different commentaries on different orders in history, I thought of Mary Beard's book, SPQR, which I tend to go back to often when contemplating the Trump administration. And she makes a comment that in the late Roman Republic, Rome's leaders understood very well that their system was failing. They understood very well that they were not living up to their own aspirations. And they were hugely creative in trying to figure out how to fix their system and how to make it better. And in fact, none of their fixes worked to save their system, and it dissolved into the history that we know. But, and in fact, as you talk about in the book, their efforts, failed though they were a rich mine for later leaders in Europe, in North America, and then globally to think about how to construct a state. And I suspect, although I'm less well educated in the non-Western orders, that one could make a similar point that many, many innovations in governance that didn't save the order or the empire or the kingdom in question were nonetheless useful later on. And so one of the things that means is that it's vitally important for us to keep innovating right now and keep producing reports like the Better Order Project, whether or not, frankly, they are the thing that drives this system to a new place. Because this is the way, as you demonstrate, human knowledge works and human beings iterate. So I actually see just the process of working on this order by itself as a powerful engine for optimism. The other engine for optimism I want to talk about is something that we don't usually think about in the same breath as global order. And that is the question that you raise toward the end of the book and toward the end of your talk about how justice within orders relates to justice between orders. And you use the example of racial justice, and you make the point that we only have racial justice in the founding UN documents because countries from the global south insisted on it. You also touch on, and you could, I think, have made more of the point that subsequently ways that we've improved upon justice and human rights goals across the globe has been largely an outgrowth of competition within orders or between orders. The interesting way that the US civil rights movement went global was exploited by the Soviets, was inspirational in the global south, but also inspired by the global south, creating wonderful circularity. And so I think we, in this sort of dangerous moment, rather than saying, as I think many are tempted to do, oh, let's put all that aside and think about other things, I think you challenge us to think about a world where justice across multiple vectors is actually essential to the perseverance of any kinds of aspects of order that point toward justice and not just toward stability. So as my very last point, I want to circle back again to something, Paula, you raised that was a little bit absent in our conversations and that I hope we can dig into more in the Q&A, and that is the question of whether the next crisis, or the crisis that we're actually living through at the moment, is a crisis of inequality, is a crisis of economic inequality, and what it would mean if we started thinking now about what global institutions that addressed inequality, both as a question of justice, but also as a question of stability, remembering that we didn't get what institutions we do have out of pure, unalloyed altruism. We got them because of enlightened self-interest. And I see the great challenge for whatever powers are emerging to be one of civil society and groups like this one, helping them think through what does enlightened self-interest look like after this moment that we're in now.
Thank you so much, Heather. Indeed, thanks so much for taking the time to delve into these two rich new publications, both for pushing our two fine authors today, and indeed all of us who are concerned with the future of international order, the U.S. role in that order, and for how the planet is governed. To think through carefully where we are, but also where we as a so-called international community need to be headed. As I shared earlier in the green room, I'm really excited now to head into this moderated discussion portion. I'm going to abbreviate it and just do one round, since Heather kindly already spoke to many of the elements of her first round question, I'm going to actually give you the lightning round question about a statement that President Trump made last week at the UN General Assembly. But this will be an opportunity in a few minutes to hear from all of you, so start thinking about your questions both online and here at Stimson. Congratulations again, Amitav, on this really tour de force in surveying 5,000 years of global history from the vantage point of a seasoned scholar of international relations and political science. If, as you argue, the West is in decline, but that world order, defined as you define it, the political architecture enabling cooperation and peace among nations, will survive, and with the rise of this fascinating concept, which I know you've been writing about for years, a global multiplex. What does this mean specifically in the areas of safeguarding human rights and the promotion of global justice? And here, of course, I'm looking at one of the defining texts right after the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the covenants in the 1970s, but norms more recently, like the responsibility to protect.
Thank you, Richard. Let me just say by saying the covenants, actually, most of them, the two major covenants came in the 1950s, just as the global south started, post-colonial states started emerging. But I think there's a difference between norms and institutionalizing them. And I cannot deny that human rights have been violated right here in the Global South, we can no longer say that things like freedom of expression, right to protest is only violated in the Global South. In fact, much more consequential violations are happening as we speak here. So let's say it's a level playing field, okay? There are creators and violators everywhere. So I would think that in a multiplex system, it is not a state-centric system. The idea of multiplex is that you move away from states or great powers and bring in the global civil society. And multi-order is basically, concentric circles or even billiard ball type of orders that do not intersect with each other, and they balance themselves with each other, or spheres of influence. The multiplex actually includes a lot of non-state actors, civil society. And to me, I mean, just yesterday, Sydney Harbour, which I used to live in Sydney. In fact, I got married in Sydney. My wife is sitting in the back. There were 300,000 people protesting against Gaza. And Australia has recognized the Palestinian state. And there's nothing more sad and tragic in the last year or so, 2 years or so, than the killing of Palestinians. So that's what will happen. That happened in South Africa's case. People have to also, take responsibility, and that's bound to happen. And that's my biggest source of optimism, that the state-centric system is still here, but there will be a time when people will rise up and civil society will rise up. And that takes you away from the traditional view of global order as an interstate system, more like a multiplex. That's the big difference between even the liberal international order and multiplex.
Thank you, Amitav. Trita, I found the Better Order Project's package of 20 reform proposals, both timely and carefully targeted, including your call for, and I'm going to quote, an automatic UN Charter review should take place each quarter century to ensure regular opportunities to reform and upgrade the architecture of the international order, end quote. In this regard, did the project lay out in any way a timetable and any characteristics of an Article 109 Charter Review Conference, including when would the first one be called for and how might it come about? And since your report comes out just a couple of weeks after the Summit of the Future last year, and it has 3 concrete actions, 39 through 41, those following the document on specifically UN Security Council reform, will it serve as a vehicle these next 4 years, the official implementation process for taking forward some of these ideas, including Article 109?
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think this actually ties a little bit to a very important comment that Heather made about that we designed it to be the moment before crisis. And as you point out, unfortunately, humanity has rarely shown the type of foresight of acting before a crisis. And instead, oftentimes, it's post-crisis. The difference, though, is that as we envisioned it, that type of a report would have become a post-Armageddon report. Because the crisis this time around is of a profoundly different nature than the crisis that we faced in the past. Obviously, the previous crisis was also very bad, but this time around, if we, for instance, end up having a war between the United States and China, that will be the bloodiest war in human history. Climate, of course, is completely existential from a planetary standpoint. So we had no choice but to try to do it pre-Armageddon than post-Armageddon. And that, of course, raises questions about some of these procedural matters and the huge difficulty of getting an Article 109 conference review. What we did is that we embedded this in our UN Security Council reform proposal. We have a different model than most of the common ones in the sense that we have created a third category of states, a semi-permanent membership. And this is done because right now, the value of being on the council as a permanent member and the value of not being there, the gap is just so enormous, which makes the cost for any rival country to allow another country, its rival, to be able to get into the council so so difficult that everything is done to make sure that no change is being made. It's one of the many difficulties, not the only ones, of course. We created a semi-permanent with a 4-year term, which is crucial because there needs to be a longer presence on the council to be able to have the depth of understanding procedural rules, etc. A lot of the complaints of the countries that get on the council for 2 years, it's only the last 6 months that they're actually effective. That's when they manage to get the hang of it. And by the time they got the hang of it, they're out. This would be taken out of a pool of 20 countries, of which 5 of them would serve in the semi-permanent category at all times. They would be elected by the General Assembly every 24 years. And since this does require a change of the charter to do this reform of the Security Council, all of the other reforms of the Council that can be done short of a reform, some of them are very good, but none of them will be sufficiently profound to meet the moment. So we had no choice but to go for something that did require a charter review. And our problem right now is that the political cost to just muster the energy needed to get to charter reform is so immense that it simply does not happen. By making it an automatic thing every 24 years, it reduces the barrier to be able to get to that point. It doesn't mean that the charter automatically will be reviewed. It still has to go through the ratification and everything else. But it at least enables us to have a more flexible system that ensures that as the world is changing at an increasing pace, we have a system that is nimble enough to be able to adjust to those cases. So for instance, in 2005, had UN Security Council reform been successful, and let's say the G4 proposal had been successful, and Japan and Germany would have gotten onto the Council, already today, 20 years later, that reform would have been out of date. Because today the likelihood of Germany and Japan getting on the Council is very, very small, given how fast the world has changed. So we need something that is more flexible, and that's why we proposed the automatic review. And in regards to the pact, one of the strongest languages, but not strong enough, in the pact is exactly 39 to 41, which calls for reform of the Security Council, addresses the historical injustice against Africa. And so it is one of the elements that has helped create the momentum for change. Still extremely difficult, but we may actually see some very interesting developments on this next year.
You know, last week in New York, the Article 109 relaunched itself, rebranded, and is advocating specifically 2030. As we all know, there'll probably be MDGs, SDGs, the post-2030 development agenda. And 2028, as I noted, the Pact for the Future comes to a crescendo of official review process. Would that be a smart period between that window, 28-30, two-year process leading up to?
Yeah, I mean, look, the process of UN Security Council reform in and of itself is going to obviously take quite some time, even with the potential change that we're hoping to see in 2026 on this matter, moving towards text-based negotiations.
Thank you. And as I said earlier, we've got to share an important question that President Trump raised in his annual speech. So this is for Heather, of course, to the General Assembly, day one of the high-level week last Tuesday. What is the purpose of the United Nations is the fundamental question that he asked. The UN has such tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential for the most part, or at least for now. End quote. I'd like to add, though, we've heard from several of his officials, including incoming, or right now, the new ambassador to the United Nations for the United States, Michael Waltz, arguing for a back-to-basics approach, which is essentially, they're saying, a focus on peace and security as the world body's core mission. So drawing upon this amazing book and report that we're discussing today, Heather, is there a clear-cut answer to this question posed by our president?
So I may surprise you with my sort of old school brutal realism here, but yeah, there's a very simple answer. The purpose of the United Nations is whatever its most powerful members decide it is, right? I mean, and this goes to your point about the Security Council, but it also gives me the opportunity. So you've each said things that 10 years ago I would have agreed with wholeheartedly. Clearly, I would have said we're moving away from a state-based system. Clearly, states are losing power relative to non-state actors. Clearly, some kind of UN security reform is essential, that it be forward-looking, review conference. Oh, that sounds fantastic. The world is changing so fast. 10 years ago, me would have said. I think a thing that we're perhaps not taking sufficiently into account here, and this is something you dismiss a little bit in the book where I might disagree, that we are absolutely seeing, and not just in the United States, a sort of revanchist movement of states that want to claw back state power, number one. And number two, you make repeatedly the point that most, if not all, of the world's great orders have had some kind of religious foundation to them. And I think we really have to take seriously the idea that this administration in the US, but again, not just this administration in the US, it's friends in Europe, Putin in Russia, think that they are recreating a Christian nationalist, or creating, because we've never had anything really like this before, a Christian nationalist world order in which they can then partner with other non-Christian but ethno or religio-nationalist orders, such as that I think envisaged by Modi in India. You could put Bolsonaro in this, and his successors, whoever they may be, in this category. And I think when we sort of glibly say things like, oh, there will continue to be a transition away from state power, or, you know, we could have a UN review conference, and that would, I mean, one can imagine a world in which several of the Security Council seats were controlled by Christian nationalist governments that could agree together on a set of core peace and security purposes for the UN. And that wouldn't be the kind of global governance that most of the people watching this conversation are thinking about, but it would reflect the legal forms of the institutions. And I think the global governance community sometimes isn't taking that seriously enough as a possible outcome.
Thank you, Heather. And now this is the chance to hear from many of you. Out of respect for our many colleagues online, I'm going to take 2 questions online, but I'll then take immediately 2 questions from the audience. When raising your question, please kindly introduce yourself, and I'm going to encourage our panelists to take just 1 or 2 of the questions that you hear. Coming in from Barcelona, the organization CIRI, Jordi Villanova writes, is there any hope for the UN organization, particularly on the issues at the heart of the Better Order Project's report, Security Council, reform and the permanent members, with some suggesting adding major middle powers such as Brazil, India, etc., and maintaining the current number, replacing middle powers like the UK, France, and even Russia. There's also the point he makes about, I think we heard from the Finnish president, Alex Stubb, last week, that if the P5 violates UN principles, should they be suspended from their membership, including on the council? A diplomat from Nikos Panayi raises a really critical question. There was a whole session on it last week in New York. How do the rise of middle powers affect the creation of a more balanced multipolar system? So those are 2 from our colleagues online. Please, I'll ask our friend, and do we have a microphone here? Kindly introduce yourself when raising. You are also able to raise a comment as well as a question, please.
For IR theory wonks like me, this is like a candy store. I have 50 questions, but I'm going to focus on one. I just wanted to say that at American University, about 3 years ago, a group of 10 of us developed a course on the history of global politics, and we dealt with the same sweep. I had Ibn Khaldun on the cover of my syllabus. I noticed you had a couple pages of him, which relates a little bit to my question. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that offline, because we struggled with a lot of what you're struggling with here, although I agree with all the points you made. What I'm struggling with more than anything else, and leaving climate change as the bigger issue off to the side for a minute, is when we did that class, that I came away from that year-long process basically concluding that the history of the world was the rise and fall of about 70 empires that matter, and then the 20th century. And we had these Enlightenment principles, which you couched perfectly fine as hypocritical, but then we get to the 20th century, and then everything changes to some degree. But the old bogeyman, which you kind of called a bogeyman, but you didn't quite, is still there, which is, how do you constrain imperial predation, right? And whether it's China with its near abroad, whether it's Israel in its own neighborhood, whether it's Russia and its neighbors, or whether it's the US globally in certain respects, right? There's nothing I'm hearing or seeing in theories of multipolarity, which often are used to justify non-Western predation, theories of multipolarity or UN reform that find a way to constrain, predatory imperial action in one's near abroad or globally. So So what's the solution to that problem? That's the big one, the sort of burden.
We'll have a second round, but one more for this round, right behind Mr. Robert Berg, a distinguished fellow here at the Stimson Center, please.
Thank you very much. Very wonderful reports. But I was wondering this. What I see you're implying is that governance, global governance, regional governance, national governments is going to be vastly more complex in this multi-sectorally growing fields, and that it's going to take a level of leadership that frankly we have rarely seen. I spent some time with Brian Urquhart, the historian of the UN, and we identified in the first 50 years of the UN maybe 13 people who were really great leaders out of hundreds who had executive positions. So I'm wondering, how do you think the talent is going to be developed for this, and will nation states allow really dynamic leaders of these regional and global institutions?
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to go reverse order this time. Heather, Trita, and Amitav, we heard on UN Security Council reform, question on middle powers and multipolarity, constraining imperial predation, and leadership in global governance. Heather.
So, I mean, the progress is going to come where the leaders are, right? And if the leaders aren't at the UN, then the progress is going to come somewhere else. One of the good things about the last 80 years is lots more people have access to leadership than did 80 years ago. I agree with you that maybe they're not turning up at international organizations, but if you hear across my comments a certain cynicism that the UN Security Council is going to be the be-all and end-all of the future of international order, then you hear that correctly. I want to make one other quick comment on this question of constraint. And indeed, one could argue that the history of the post-Cold War era is a history of not just the US Trita, and here again I would disagree with you pretty strenuously, but of the whole international system making more and more rules which more and more great powers felt more and more free to ignore or selectively enforce. And one could argue that that's been true throughout history, but we live in an era where it's more and more obvious that more and more great powers are ignoring or only imposing on others the standards they've set for themselves. So figuring out how we live with that hypocrisy in a world where everybody can see everything, or how we move past it. Sorry, one other tiny thing I want to say, because I think it's important, if you'll indulge me, is exactly, frankly, one of the ways that the forces of ethno-nationalist order are winning right now is by creating so much chaff and churn in the system that even the most brilliant leader has no time to think about anything but short-term responses. So one of the very real gifts that we need to give ourselves and each other is for some leader somewhere to be able to be thinking long-term and to be able to be developing ways that different forces in the multiplex can come together, because right now leaders and forces and nations are being successfully atomized.
And I can't let this slip, the next Secretary General race. Any personal favorites who will hopefully announce her candidacy in the next couple of weeks?
I don't have a personal favorite. Maybe I'll just say that I'm still feeling, just personally, I'm having a little difficulty investing my personal hope in that the international community, or that any community, will actually invest in women's leadership. So I look forward to being proven wrong on that.
Trita.
Thank you. Some great questions. Let me first start off with a question regarding UN Security Council reform and whether some of these ideas are possible in the sense of reducing some of the P5 or eliminating some of them, given the fact that, you know, if Council was to be recreated today from scratch, obviously some of them would not be getting permanent memberships and vetoes. Reality when it comes to UN Security Council reform, of course, is finding that very, very slim balance between what is desired and what is possible. And what is not possible is to have any of the members of the council, the permanents, to give up their permanent seat. What is not possible is to get them to give up their vetoes. What I think can be made possible, particularly in a moment when the P5 actually is disunited, which is almost a prerequisite to get the type of change that is needed, because the previous instances we have in which change has come about is when the rest of the world essentially is imposing itself on a disunited P5, is restrictions on the veto. And we've seen some proposals that have already been adapted that are helpful, but I think insufficient. One of the things we're proposing, and we think there is a decent chance to be able to get it, is to move towards a formula of either veto plus 1 or veto plus 2, which means any veto-wielding country that throws in a veto has to have at least 1 or 2, depending on the size of the council, other state that is also voting with that veto state, and does not have to be a P member, a permanent member. Otherwise, the veto is not insulated, which means that the matter goes to the General Assembly, and a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly can overturn that veto, and the resolution automatically passes. All of the previous vetoes we have seen by the United States and Russia on Ukraine and Gaza would have passed if this rule was in existence right now. Is it difficult? Undoubtedly it is. But I think there is a pathway to it because of the fact that the biggest losers of the Council completely losing its relevance, its power, its influence is ultimately the P5 members themselves, because they would lose the value of the veto. So there has to be some sort of a compromise. I think we have reached a moment. Many of them are going to be flexible because they recognize that if they're not flexible, if the UK and France is not flexible, they're the countries that are the most likely to be questioned as to whether they should even be on the council with a permanent seat. So I think there is a momentum and opportunity. Obviously, it's still going to be very, very difficult, but we're in that moment in which the space between what is desirable and very good, I mean, I think it would be nice if the Finnish president's proposal was adopted, but what is actually feasible, we're starting to see that widen slightly. If I could just say something on the leadership production. I had a great conversation on Min Chiu Than's new book on his grandfather, U Thant, yesterday, The Peacemaker. And much of the conversation also ended up both before and after on the failure of producing the right type of leaders these days. And I wholeheartedly agree with Heather when it comes to some of these challenges. But we also have to recognize that in the age of social media, it is democratic states that are going to have a greater challenge of being able to create that type of a space for leaders to be able to think long term. They already have a disadvantage, but that disadvantages have been profoundly deepened by social media.
Thank you. And before I turn to Amitav, I know some people online are not used to our new system. Just look at the instructions at the bottom of the screen, and it shows you how you can enter a question. Amitav, please.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions, and of course, I would like to respond to some of Heather's points as well. But let me start with middle powers, because I attended a very big conference in Chatham House in June on middle powers. The problem with middle powers is that who are the middle powers? And one big change has happened defining, recognizing middle powers between the Cold War and today. During the Cold War, when we talk about middle powers, we should think of all the Western powers, Canada, Australia, Norway, Sweden, Scandinavian countries. Now, the ranks of middle powers include a lot of global South, non-Western countries, including South Korea. India, middle power, great power, wannabe great power. So this conversation always comes down to defining who is a middle power. And of course, they are no longer the club of the West like Canada, Australia, Scandinavia. But I think the role of middle powers will be mainly, one thing hasn't changed, is agenda setting. They will continue to set the agenda for new, whether it's a responsibility to protect or human rights or sustainable development. I think they can play an important role. The ranks of middle power has swelled now, and there is a Indonesia is a middle power, so we can actually do more with them. On your question about empire, and also I'd love to see your syllabus, because this book, by the way, was born out of a first-year seminar. I started in 2014, I mentioned this earlier, and most of my interlocutors were my students who will be actually present as MCs when I launched this book in my school on the 8th of November. They are the MCs, 8th of October rather. Now, we are all living in empires, by the way. Empire has been the basis of world order. And legacy of empire, this was an empire too. The United States, by the way, I want to start with, had two models, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. So it's good to have this point. So the founders of the United States, I hate to say founding fathers, but founders, they actually identified, including George Washington with the Roman Republic, the people who wrote the, Jefferson and the Federalist Papers, called themselves Publius. So it was the Roman Republic was the model, not the empire. But today, the empire is alive and the republic is falling. That's what Trump has done. Basically, checks and balances, the foundation of the republic was checks and balances. So the empire, on the other hand, is alive and well. So you have to remember that. But empires are also, there are empires and there are empires. There have been brutal empires, there have been benevolent empires. There are wide variations. And empire is also not the only basis of world order. There is the independent state system. I mentioned a few of them all over the world, and also suzerain systems in between an empire and independent state system. So world order is a complexity of different types of forms, and I would think that it depends on, and all empires rise and fall. We should not, we have made the mistake of wishing away empires. The age of empires is over. To me, it has never been over. And if you remember that, you may be able to come to reality about how to deal with them. And moving on to global governance complexity, fragmentation, I actually call it pluralization. I'm probably a bit controversial. We think fragmentation is inevitable and maybe creative. There is something Schumpeter's word, creative destruction. And I think multilateralism, one of the things that's happening, I know I mentioned about the participation of people and civil society. I have this term called G+, government plus, not G1, G2, G20, but G+. The plus is the organized civil society, even people with social media. They are playing an important role. A lot of the global governance in human rights, in climate change, is actually partnerships, hybridity, complexity. And I see that as a positive trend. And I also see no single country is leading in every area of global governance. The European Union is still a leader when it comes to climate change. China in development, infrastructure, and United States, of course, can lead if it wants to in collective security. India, in other places, regional leadership. So let's think of the multiplex as a world of differentiated leadership. And it might lead to chaos, but it might lead to new possibilities. And very finally, pessimism. I have a section in the book called The Balance of Fear, not the balance of terror or balance of power. Who is more afraid of change? Opinion polls after opinion polls show is the people in the West are more fearful. They have more to lose. People in China, India, less fearful. Okay, that's one thing. Second, Trump and pre-Trump. We have, 10 years ago, we had this conversation. We will worry about, actually my book was the first one, the previous book, to say the liberal order is over. But liberal order was alive and well with Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton waiting in the wings, and or maybe Joe Biden. Nobody thought about the end of the liberal order. That Trump has made that change. And Trump too had actually made that further change. The difference between chaos and mayhem is Donald Trump. And we will not have this. The fear of lack of compassion, it's a fact. That's how I read it. The difference between instability, which is bound to happen, any change, or fear of mayhem, total global disorder, total lack of compassion, boils down to one regime. It's a regime. It's not the United States that I know of.
Thank you, Amitav. Time for one more round. If people keep brief, we'll take as many as we can, and then we're going to encourage our panelists to wrap up with taking one or two of the questions that jumps out at them. Two more online, though. I mentioned the Article 109 rebranded launch last week in New York, and voila, we have their coalition director asking a question, Ms. Heba Ali, based in Geneva. I would love to hear Trita and Amitav's response to Heather's suggestion that a UN Charter Review Conference would lead to Security Council seats controlled by Christian nationalists, or, as I've heard, other worry, more power to authoritarians and their visions of the world. From Masiak Jasrezebic of the European Parliament staff, I'm glad he has a question on the G20. Do you see prospects for the G20 becoming more institutionalized especially with the upcoming U.S. presidency. I'd like to take the liberty as the moderator to just add any thoughts on the fact that we've had these 4 major developing countries, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, leading candidates for a permanent seat on the Security Council, as the presidents the last couple of years. Do we see any hope of continuity of the agendas where they put development at front and center for next year with the U.S., let alone the U.K. and Canada after the U.S.? Please, kindly introduce yourself. We have a microphone, and let's hear from as many as that we can take before we wrap up.
Thank you. The book looks great. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a political psychologist with Transcend International and Speaking of Fear and Civil Society. I've been going to all but one nuclear conference that is in New York, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Ban Treaty, TPNW, and the conference on WMD-free Middle East as a representative of civil society. And the dynamics are always that all of civil society and most countries in the world are, wanting to, nuclear disarmament, and all the, as you know, all the nuclear powers and their allies under the umbrella. So there's always like a food fight, and after like 4 weeks of the review conference at 9 o'clock on the last Friday night, it falls apart over Israel. And the Ban Treaty which won the Nobel Peace Prize, was much more fun because they didn't show up, and also. So anyway, I know you're dealing with the Security Council, but what are your thoughts about the impossible dynamics in the conferences?
Thank you. I saw some in the back. Please, Yash.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Yash Tadimala. I am a postdoctoral fellow here in DC, and I have the honor of partnering with Richard on the AI Impact Coalition, which we've been working on for a while, following the Pact for the Future and Digital Compact and tech components of it. My question is, you mentioned world orders, and you mentioned G+, kind of. How do we approach the world order where we have these tech companies or financial institutions that fall outside of this order, and they've been successful in being interoperable across all of these orders, and they're not constrained by the rules of citizens or civilians, which most empires do. And I think many of us have read Karen Howe's The Empire of AI. It is an empire across these emperors and tech hegemons. So where do they fall in this, and what is their role? Because they seem to be unbound and unregulated.
Thank you. Yes, to your left.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm a retired business executive, international, with ComSat, IBM, VeriSign technology companies, and an editorial contributor to various publications. I hate to throw sort of a wrench in this, but it'd be interesting to hear your reaction to Donald Trump's totally contrary theory of international relations. I heard the guy speak about 30 years ago when he was a New York investor, and he made clear then what I think we keep seeing over and over again today. And what he said then was something to the effect of, the U.S. leaders are all stupid. This is a world in which it's every man for himself, his words, and I'm the giant in the room and they're the pygmies. The last thing I would ever want to do is negotiate with all the midgets at the same time. I don't want one international trade agreement. I want 100 international trade agreements between us, and that this is all about winning. This is all about getting your way. I can get my way with each country individually. Same thing with defense. I don't want a defense agreement with Europe, NATO, or any of that. I want 20 different defense agreements, because in each case I can squeeze them to get exactly what I want. So his theory was, and by the way, he ascribed it to everything he learned when his parents sent him away to military school. This is all about winning. This is all about getting your way, and because we're so big, we can get our way. And it would be interesting to hear what would you tell Donald Trump if you had 30 seconds to explain to him what's wrong with his winning philosophy, which we keep seeing over and over again today. Thank you.
And time for one final question. This gentleman here down to the right. I apologize for others who might have had questions online or here at the Stimson Center. And please kindly introduce yourself.
Very much. Anton Fedyashin, American University. We're representing here today, but history department. I know what book I'm assigning next year, by the way, because this is great. I have a very quick comment and then a very quick question. Amitav, if I understood you, you were sequencing the American Republic and the Empire. I couldn't disagree more. They coexisted from the very beginning, and one of the most interesting aspects of American history is their interaction, if I understood you correctly.
No,
but the question,
I said they coexisted. I agree with you.
okay.
Yeah.
The question is about BRICS. Could you address what you think its role is, if any, in the New World Order? Thank you.
Great. Well, this time let's begin with Professor Acharya. I'm glad to see such a strong American University contingent. My wife happens to teach there as well. Please.
Republic and empire coexisted, but at different levels. In the society, Rome, the idea was Rome, okay? Most people would not know republic versus empire. So the classics were very popular among the settlers and the schools and institutions. The founders who drafted the Constitution, they were basically more fond of the republic because they wanted to learn the lesson from the empire, that how republic fell into becoming an empire. So they call themselves Publius. George Washington, Preston himself, as one of the generals that founded the republic, who retired into the farmhouse as he would. And so there's a lot of discourse. Please take a look at my book. But I think we sometimes confuse the republic and the empire. We think America was built on the Republican model. But what I would say, the domestic institutions are based on the Republican model. The foreign policy was always imperial. It was, so America was both a republic in domestic politics, institutions, balance of power, but empire in foreign policy, Monroe Doctrine, Mexico, the American Indians. So I'm very happy you raised that question because I spent a lot of time getting that one right, and I think I got it right. Sorry, I don't want to take any more time, but the question that I have taken down in my paper, technological companies, and also Donald Trump. I think we should, I reserve my judgment on Trump. I mentioned some things that may sound critical, but I am also hoping that he will solve these wars. I'm hoping to see the action. Just a lot of words doesn't make sense. And in 4 years, if he has actually solved the Russia-Ukraine war, the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would give him credit for that. But we haven't seen anything yet. I mean, we've seen a lot of words and claims, Nobel Prize being claimed even before anything has been really done. And some of them are based on, like India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Thailand. We have to question whether that's really the case. But the big conflict he can solve with full credit to him, no matter what he does to domestic politics. Give him 3 more years, 3.5. This is a democracy. He has won a mandate, so I'm happy. But what I would like to want all of us, tell us, he is breaking a bargain that was the heart of the American-led world order, which is that the United States, the most powerful country in the world, could actually accept restraints and provide public goods. And John Eikenberry makes that point. I criticize him from time to time, but I also agree that there was an idea that the United States can balance its dominance, which was without question true, by giving others a chance to share the rule and creating multilateral institutions. Now, Mr. Trump now thinks that's not necessary anymore. The market access to the U.S. Why we are in such a situation, why Trump is powerful today? But the United States went from being the largest exporter in the world to being the largest importer in 40 years. And everybody wanted American market and import less, export more too, even China. And he saw this as an opportunity for manipulation. But that means giving up a big public good that you have provided to basically legitimize the dominance. He thinks he can take on all the countries. He can take on China, take on Russia, take on India, take on everybody. And that could be a fallacy. That could be an undoing. And finally, one point about this, what I'm talking about, let's not have self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't think you meant that, but I believe that a lot of self-fulfilling prophecy, that the order is crumbling, chaos is coming, mayhem is coming, it will happen. So let's have some optimism in between. And there are, like NATO expansion, Russia will be a threat, Russia became a threat, because we have to keep NATO going. I see self-fulfilling prophecy as a major driver of world history, and it's very important to avoid it at this point.
Thank you, Amitav. Trita.
Thank you. Because we're short on time, I'll focus just on one question, and that's the question Heba asked, and she's doing a wonderful work with the coalition she's leading on charter review. Yes, there may be exactly what Heather says, that there ends up becoming more non-democracies in the council. I would have to say, though, I have a couple of problems with the idea that this is something we need to fix. Democracy is on retreat globally. You expand the council, you are statistically more likely to get non-democracies. The way to fix that problem is not to rig the game when it comes to UN Security Council reform, but actually address the challenges that democracy is having here at home. That's where you actually fix the problem, rather than thinking that you have to divide the world according to these different lines. And again, this is something that the previous administration did with this democracy versus authoritarian frame that they had, which divided the world in a manner that I think is actually more conducive to creating problems. And it's also fundamentally challenging because it essentially made international law contingent upon your domestic political makeup, whereas international law treats all states as the same. But if you're now suddenly starting to create a hierarchy in which, and we saw that in the manner in which the Germans exonerated Israel for what it's doing in Gaza because it's a democracy. I mean, if we live in that type of a world in which democracies get some sort of a free hand to do things that are in complete violation of all laws and norms of war, then we're creating a terrible, terrible world. So I am concerned about the fact that that could end up becoming the case. But the fix to that is to fix it at home rather than thinking that we can rig the game.
Thank you, Trita. And the final word goes to Heather.
So 2 things. On the G20, the answer to the question of will the G20 be institutionalized, this comes back to this question of can middle powers, can countries that see the benefits of some of these structures get together to defend and institutionalize them. So it is entirely up to the participants in the G20. I want to call out here, Richard, I know you're involved in some civil society activities around the G20. There's a really interesting labor G20 that's in the works. So I think there are really interesting opportunities there for civil society and governments to get together and say, hey, there are things here that we actually want to try to save. So I point to that as a spot for hope. And I want to come back a bit to the Trump point, because I think just to challenge something that you've both just said, because I think it's, I mean, you make this point so profoundly in the book, and you've just kind of contradicted it. Either we live in a world where we can have a good and improving international system while our domestic systems get worse, or we don't. And you can dislike or you can think that the Biden administration didn't do this well, but that doesn't mean that you can easily sketch out a world where the major powers become less just at home and the international order becomes more just. And I don't think that's actually possible. And so I do think we're stuck in this situation where we have to fix things at home and fix them globally at the same time. That's not a neat line we can draw anymore. And so maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Since you were name-checked, I'll give you the opportunity, but 30 seconds.
I think domestic politics also changes. I mean, I think even in the United States, it might change. So let's not, again, I have this thing about tempocentrism, thinking of the contemporary current as the rule and the eternity. Things change. I have seen things change in the United States. I came here first time when Reagan was president. I've seen the United States go through, and I've seen India go through cycles. And I think just 20 years ago, we thought democracy, end of history, right? It sounded crazy, but we thought there were more democracies than authoritarian states at that, and 30 years ago. Now it's completely different. So I think of change as inevitable, and change can go both ways. So currently, I agree with you. You cannot have a global order of justice and cooperation with authoritarian capricious rulers at home. But I don't think neither is unchangeable. That's the basic message of the book.
Great note to conclude on. Round of applause for our incredible panel. We look forward to having all of you back to continue this type of conversation here and elsewhere, I'm sure, for many years to come. Let me thank, though, of course, Heather, Trita, Amitav, one last time, very thoughtful, historically grounded contributions today. To our co-sponsors, the UN Association of the National Capital Area and the Academic Council on the UN System, my Stimson colleagues for their many, many hours of work behind the scenes to make this event possible, and to all of you for being here for your contributions. Happy start of the trick-or-treat season. We very much hope you'll consider buying a signed copy of Professor Acharya's new book, and I'm sure many of you have copies now of the Better Order Project report, which I'm sure Trita would happily sign as well, and we'll look forward to getting you back online and here to Stimson again soon. Thank you once again.